All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Product Strategy Live. This is episode number 7, but it's the first one that we've done in a long time. How long, Michael, Melissa, David? How long do you reckon it's been?
It feels like the last one was talking about Veeam, right?
Yeah.
I
So
think
that
so.
when was Veeam on? Veeam on was like middle of June. So wow, about 5 or 6 weeks. Crazy. And you'd think we'd been busy during that time or something, but no, we've been busy. It's been a crazy time actually. So VMon came and went. We had a great event, and since then, I think everyone's been just nonstop. And this world situation hasn't changed. I mean, when we first ran this, when was it? Like March, and we were like, yeah, this will be over in a few weeks. No worries. And there, David sitting in a car, ready to get a test again.
With no bums.
No, he's not really having a test. He's already had a couple. He's desperate to get tested positive for this thing. But anyway, so welcome everybody. Today, we're going to talk about something that's, well, it's been front and center for a long time, and we haven't really addressed it as a group in this format. But it's security, ransomware, and just general security in our industry today, and in the day and age of cybercrime. And in the last couple of weeks especially, there's been some really big incidents that have again highlighted the fact that this thing is so real, and companies just have to be so aware that they are up for attack, and those attacks can be devastating to their business, their livelihoods, and their customers as well. So we're going to spend the next, 30 or so minutes having a bit of a conversation about that. We're going to, leverage. Melissa is a mad security nut. She loves talking about security. So, this is her time to shine, and have some good conversation about it. But I think we've all kind of experienced either firsthand or secondhand or whatever it might be, just examples of companies that have been impacted by, ransomware or just general exploits or malicious attacks. So, Melissa, why don't you just kick us off and chat a little bit about what you've seen happen, maybe not so much in the last couple of weeks, because we'll touch on those specifically a little bit later on, but just generally in the last sort of 5 to 10 years with regards to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're all VMware people here, right? So let's think about VMware for a while. When I was first starting out as a vSphere administrator, I don't ever remember security patches, maybe once in a while, but it was never like, hey, there's this critical thing. And when anybody talked about VMware security, it was always the hypervisor escape. So I could go on a whole diatribe about that. But the fact is, if you take something like ESXi, right? One of the things from going to ESX to ESXi, it was supposed to be less code, smaller install, reduce the attack surface, because at that point, it was becoming a hugely important enterprise piece of critical infrastructure. So as such, people began going after it, right? So we've seen vSphere upgrades, and this is something I talk a lot about on my blog, become so much easier over the time. And really, besides making it easier to go to the next version of vSphere, it makes it easier to patch your vCenters and your ESXi hosts. Because remember the whole Intel debacle when the Intel exploits came out, and it was basically everything, everyone who ran on Intel, day zero, VMware had all the patches out. Everybody had all the patches out. So unless you were versed in quickly patching your vSphere infrastructure, testing things, et cetera, it might have taken you a while to do that. So vSphere Lifecycle Manager is a new thing in vSphere 7. It makes patching and upgrading even easier. So it's kind of become more of a routine vSphere patching thing versus this one-off thing that maybe you paid attention to, maybe you didn't. And that's something that, back in the day, only people worried about Windows. No one worried about Linux. No one worried about routers or switches. Everybody just went after Windows because that was the most prevalent thing. But,
well, in fact, it was opposite. Not opposite, but what it was that the perception was Linux was.
Oh, you didn't need antivirus on Linux, right? You don't need that.
Yeah,
don't worry about
Linux was safe. Right. That was the perception, and any appliance was safe. You were never going to get an exploit on because any sort of networking appliance or whatever. People just weren't
doing it. It just wasn't being done. It wasn't inherently any safer. It was just people were focused on Windows, and that's what people were used to, writing viruses and malware for. But now all this Unix stuff is just as vulnerable as everything else. So it's been a
That's
huge
important.
paradigm shift in the last 10 years where now you have to basically look at everything, and everything's vulnerable. Your smart TV is vulnerable. Anything that runs code and connects to the internet is now something that could potentially be attacked.
Yeah, that's a good look at it, and that's that's at a base level, the hypervisor level. But you're right, a lot of people focused obviously back in the day on the desktop, which is the Windows desktop, because obviously the Windows desktop in enterprise, just endpoints, that's the most vulnerable point of a network because that's your weakest link, and your weakest link is your user, and it's your uneducated user.
Oh yeah, we could talk about
right?
that too. It's the users. That's a huge problem.
But yeah, I mean, Michael, what's your take? Because I mean, you've come from a different sort of area than I guess myself and Melissa. But what have you seen in your years? I guess maybe before Veeam and now working for Veeam, because you're at the coalface for a few years as an SE as well.
Yeah, so I think similar to what Melissa's saying is that, well, now it's a really important thing that people need to have. Not just like we've always had security patches, vulnerability patches. They've just never been that easy to implement. And I think the tool set from the vendors to make that easier have all developed to make things easier. But I think there's a much bigger threat now as well with the likes of ransomware and a lot more public. Yeah. So I don't want to get into that before you get us into what we were going to talk about. But I think the ransomware story when I started as an SE it was there, but it just wasn't that. It wasn't a daily topical thing that you were talking about. Yeah. Now it seems to be we're having several conversations every day about ransomware and about how not only from a remediation point of view, and it's mad that we're also having them conversations about prevention when kind of from a Veeam point of view, we can't stop. We can't stop the ransomware attack, the threat coming into your data center, into your environment. But I think how aggressive it's become over the last few years is really quite interesting. And going back to both of your points around the user, and I think that's where anyone, if I was going back into end user world and I had to look after an IT estate, I'd be quite comfortable that the IT environment, the operations team would absolutely understand what ransomware is, what would they do if they got it, how would they deal with it. But what would your end user, what would Sally in finance do? How would she work if there was a threat? How would like your salespeople still be able to function and work with their daily task like that? I'd be thinking about them more so because the users need education on that.
Yeah, and it's so sophisticated these days as well. Like I got a couple of emails this morning from what looked like our internal expense department. And I thought, like when I first looked at it, I was like, well, firstly, I haven't traveled, so I haven't expensed anything. So what's going on? So that was my first flag. But then, I still checked it, and then I went, hold on, that's just a blatant phishing attack. Again, it was very sophisticated, right? And, for me to look at it, to give it a second look, just tells you that me as an educated user still initially was a little bit like, oh, what is that? So an uneducated user, I would say of the caliber of, say, my mum, as an example, would have clicked on that. And then that is the weakest point. David, you love to tell a story, just taking a little bit of a different tangent about a particular company that was effectively just ruined overnight. Start off with that one, because I think that leads into what we want to talk about with the other companies and whatnot.
Yeah.
You don't need to name names.
No. So well, it's quite open, and everyone kind of who's reads my blogs knows about it anyway. But there was a company called Code Spaces probably like 8 years ago, and they were all in AWS. And interestingly, they backed up all their workloads. They stored all their data in S3, and it was phenomenal business. They were doing really well. And then someone, and you know this quite well, Spiteri, managed to get access to one of their root access keys. And then they basically managed to log into AWS. So they sent the CEO basically a ransom demand saying, if you don't send me the money, then we're going to delete all your data. And he was like, well, I'm not going to pay you. And we have all backups, so we're not worried about it. And so they eventually deleted all their production data and still refused to pay the ransom. So then the hackers then decided to go and delete all their backups as well, because it was all in the same account.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because that company was literally wiped out overnight just from someone getting an access key. Now, obviously, AWS has changed its security best practices since then. You know, things have moved on a lot since 2012.
Yeah.
But it just shows that from a security perspective, you need to consider all possible outcomes. They weren't worried because they had all their data protected and backed up. But of course,
they thought they did.
Same account.
Yeah. And that sort of attack, that was really unsophisticated. That was more, you'd have to think someone's leaving a password lying around, or even some social engineering, right? Like that was very unsophisticated, and that still happens today. And just to lead on to that,
still the biggest like hacks that happen, isn't it? Social engineering and all that with iCloud and celebrities' photos being leaked on the internet that they supposedly don't want out there.
So I used to do a thing called war driving. It was called back in the day. I don't know if you guys remember that. I basically used to go around and look for open Wi-Fi networks, and basically then, you know, hop onto it and whatnot. But what I did was actually interesting. For about 3 months, this is before I started really working, I actually turned into a bit of a business where I went around the suburbs, did the war driving, and then I charged $50 to go in and actually fix their routers. Pretty cool. It was a good way to do it.
Good idea, yeah.
It was good social hacking for good. But yeah, no. So, and my other thing that I always remember about that time, David, was and this is the thing that always scared me about working in a hosting company, being ultimately responsible for a platform that was hosting, you know, thousands and thousands of websites and people's businesses and lives, is that there was a particular company in Australia that got wiped out from the inside, where it was either a malicious, a disgruntled employee, or someone who had access. It was someone that was angry with the company, and effectively they went in from basically the inside out and systematically deleted backups, storage, compute, networking, everything, and left them with literally nothing, absolutely nothing. And like you said, company was a big company. It was a big hosting company, thousands of customers, just obliterated overnight. And that was my real first concern. And I went, geez, do I really want to be, you know, risking my own personal reputation for something that could happen? And that's led on, Melissa, to that CVE exploit that I was talking about earlier with regards to vCloud Director. I wrote a blog about this a couple of months ago when that exploit came out, which basically allowed a user to elevate to administrator, come in through the Cloud Director portal and effectively have their way, which means you could delete everything. And that was literally my worst nightmare. And that stuff can happen, right? But that was an exploit that was detected that could have been, you know, used by a malicious user to do that on a grand scale and just wipe out so many people's lives.
I remember this had to be well over 10 years ago because I was still a customer and I was a vSphere administrator. And there was a story going around, like somebody fired their vSphere admin, but never removed their accounts from the hosts and just never whacked the account.
Happens often.
So this dude was so angry, he went to McDonald's with his personal laptop, still could connect through back doors and everything he had, and just started destroying the vSphere environment basically because he could and he was angry. So, you know, there's so many different attack vectors and threats out there. It's really important to have a cohesive strategy, right, to manage those exploits, manage malicious users, manage internal threats, manage social engineering. It's just security is this huge thing. It's not just like an evil hacker doing something bad, right?
Yeah, well, that's why I guess the emergence recently of the chief security information officer has come. Like, you didn't see them 2 or 3 years ago, right? But all of a sudden they're popping up. It's a new CIO type of situation, right? So it just shows you that companies are so worried about the threat. They need to hire someone who has some really high intimate knowledge of this industry to dictate the strategy, which is huge, right? But it's really funny though, because, you know, Michael talked about the fact that you can't detect it, and it's a funny one because a lot of marketing out there will gladly say that this is your ransomware detection software. You're going to be totally protected if you have this, right? X, Y, Z. I think, Michael, you know the reality of that, and it's not really the way. Like, if anyone's trying to sell you that, I think it's a bit of a false horizon, isn't it?
Yeah, 100%. And that whole security thing security goes right down to actually people being able to get into the doors of your data center and actually go in. There is no vendor out there that can say we can protect you fully in terms of, like, if you've got a disk array and it's got all your production data on, you've got another disk array, which is where your backups are stored. If someone gets into that system and everything from permissions, from security ACLs and stuff like that are all good, and that you haven't just given God mode to everyone like we do in our lab. But ultimately, if you get into that building, that data center, you could still lift that tin up. You could just pull out the cables and it's down, or you can throw it in the sea and it's down. And I think, to go back to what Melissa was just touching on as well, is that how important that security is it's not just about the four walls anymore, about this data center or the on-premises, the vSphere environment, because people are now dipping their toe in, and there's a scale of how much you're dipping your toe in the public cloud as well. And now your attack vector then becomes even so much bigger as well. And how do you approach that as well? So I think there's no product that will go, you're going to be ransomware protected. You're never going to get
we
that.
guarantee.
And even if there was, right, even if it's Melissa's awesome security product guarantees that it will detect ransomware and blah, 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 there's still an administration and operations team in here. And let's face it, people buy all these security things. They have all this alerting and monitoring set up, but alert fatigue is real. People stop looking at the stuff because there's too much stuff coming in.
Or the cried wolf,
Exactly. Yeah. So it's more, even if you have a product, it's beyond, it's still the human vector, right? But okay, what if you have an administrator, they get an alert ransomware activity, but what if they're in on it, right? And they say, okay, it's good, we're fine, right? So there really is no one single, what would be the equivalent of a single pane of glass here? A single product to rule them all? I don't know.
Yeah, it's just the fact that you said single pane of glass. Just the fact you said single pane of glass shows you that there's an element of BS with it.
There's no such thing.
It's funny because Cade reminded me of physical access and whatnot. I remember when I was an early admin in my first job, and I went into the data center, and we had a KVM unit with keyboard, mouse plugged into our infrastructure VM. I thought I was on Windows, but I was on Linux, and I pressed Control Delete. And everything restarted, and my boss rang up and said, "What's going on?" I'm like, "I don't know. Oh, it's just rebooted. I don't know what's happening." But that's just an example of just the ease of that. And that was, again, early days, but it can still happen today, where that was just such a simple mistake that could have just triggered a whole series of events. The one thing I wanted to touch on, Michael alluded to it a little bit with regards to the spread of our workloads now covering public cloud, moving into new platforms, microservices, Kubernetes, containers. How do you, because you've dealt a bit with that, how do you see ransomware and security in that world? Are we ready to talk about it in that world yet? Because I don't even know if we're ready to talk about networking in that world.
Yeah, well, security certainly when you're looking at microservices and stuff, I think there still needs to be a lot decided around that. One of the good things about when you're looking at like Kubernetes and microservices and even like just functions as a services, anything happens to them, you can kind of just get rid of them, spin them up again, and off you go. So from that perspective, there's some opportunities. But I think certainly from a security perspective, when you look at it all, having to actually, with all these different platforms, it's not like when you were saying in the old days you had Linux and Windows and all you had to do was protect the desktops. While ransomware and antivirus back in the day with Windows was the challenge, it was one platform. Now we've got all these different platforms and all these different areas, all these different locations. We've got multiple data centers, some workloads in your own on-prem data center, some out in the cloud, in AWS, then you've got Kubernetes running somewhere else. How you actually manage all of those platforms from a ransomware and security perspective is the biggest challenge, because
I think we saw that, right? Like, obviously, without naming it, we all are aware of sort of a bigger fitness tracker company last week that got done. I mean, everyone knows about it, right? So pick whoever you want it to be. But that was a situation where they just kind of went, right, we've been done. We just have to shut down everything because we just have no way, in theory, to deal with this at the moment. So the safest thing that they thought was to shut everything down, right? And that's what you were talking about there, David, the fact that there's so many systems now that spread over just, endpoints, traditional on-premises servers, cloud servers, containerized platforms, wherever they might be, right? So it's very hard to limit that attack vector and say, how do we stop it spreading now? If it's sophisticated enough to get through the firewalls, any sort of jumps, it's like a virus jumping through, an air-gapped sort of environment, right? Because it's going to work. It's going to work its way through. What was that?
Like a pandemic, like the virus that's going around at the moment, right? It's
like a pandemic. It's like it is, right? Yeah, exactly.
So I have a question. Who restored the simulation and forgot to run secure restore before they did it? That's what I want to know, because someone messed this whole thing up in 2020. Let's just restart, run secure restore. Michael, you might want to talk about that and fix everything.
I don't know about that. But I guess the other point of that is that, so there's two sides to that particular situation. It was obviously the business side. The business was impacted, and they had decisions to make, and whatever they had to make. But on the consumer side, I know that I rely on that sort of data, and people might see that data as being insignificant, right? It's just ones and zeros, talking about your weight, talking about how much time you've run 5 kilometers, very slow for me. But, it's all about the personal connection that you have to that data. And I know that and Michael was talking about this earlier, a lot of people actually base their mood off doing this activity and seeing how they're trending and what they're doing in the week compared to last week. It's a gamification of their life. But it can also be the difference between feeling good about yourself and not. So I kind of think that even though we might see it, or some people might see it as, it's just some data that's on a wearable and it's not important. For some people, it might actually be life and death, because it might actually make them feel one way or the other if they don't have that data. So how do we deal with the fact that there's all this data being generated on the edge in Internet of Things devices, wearables, and they're potentially always at risk, and they're the new target almost, because they know these attackers, when they come in, the guys that are running in these custom Lamborghinis, as it is, they know that if they hit this particular company, it's going to have maximum impact. Therefore, they're going to generate maximum return.
So I think it comes back to that education point, right? So I use fitness trackers as well, as we probably all have something that collects data, because that's what we do, right? But the whole impact comes in, and we're aware of the situation. We knew that this is a ransomware attack. They've just shut down all of their services. Even if only one of the services is affected, they cannot let that spread and cause bigger problems. So they've shut it down, and then it goes into remediation stage of, right, how do we remediate the problem before then looking to our backups to potentially restore and recover that data and get it back up for our customers. But I was speaking to a load of rugby mates who are not in the same game as us. They don't live in the IT industry. So, okay, they might have heard ransomware here and there in the news because it's that topical, because it's an everyday occurrence. But they don't understand, why would the fitness tracker, why would the company shut down everything? Because it would stop the spread. So the easy question, or the easy answer for me was, well, think about how we as a country have locked down to stop the virus spread across the world or across different places within the country and stop. And it's exactly the same analogy, right, when it comes to ransomware. And they seem to get it. I don't know if they all got it, being rugby lab. But yeah, I think it comes down, and repeat what I just said, is about education. Like we always talk about within the business, we always talk about the IT workforce or the sales force, or making sure that people understand when they open up an email, they need to be cautious of what that could be. But actually, it's home users as well, because your desktop is just as vulnerable to be attacked in the same way as a business. Obviously, the implications aren't ever going to be as big, but they're still pretty. It's still pretty serious, and we all need to understand what this is. Because, and going back to another piece as well, Anthony, that you mentioned, is that the business made a decision. Every business needs to include the IT as that part of the business, because if that company, especially that company that we're talking about, is so heavily reliant on the IT department, the IT team, if anything, that's probably their biggest asset, is that data.
Yeah.
And okay, we're, as consumers of that service, we want that data to keep our daily trends, our weekly trends, and all of that, our weight loss and all of that in managed. But where's that data then going? And I expect that potentially a company like that is sharing some of that data, anonymized, but sharing that data, and that's potentially their biggest revenue stream, rather than us as consumers buying their products.
Interesting, the power and the data. Yeah, that's an interesting point there. But we assume that the data is being backed up. I mean, surely. I mean, when you think about that sort of telemetric data, the assumption is someone's backing it up somewhere. Now, we don't know that in this particular situation, whether my assumption is during the shutdown, they just shut down everything just to make sure it was all good. So the actual backup data or the data they had probably wasn't impacted, but they weren't sure. So they just basically cut it off, right, to protect it all. So the question is, if it did get impacted, would they have brought it back? Now, just say, for example, if that had been the worst case scenario and they were not able to get the data back, would that company still be around today? What would it do? I mean, I think the company almost goes under.
Well, I guess it depends on what the terms and conditions are, though. You know, we always look at this from a technology perspective, but you need to go up a level. What are you actually expecting from the service? You know, it's like, so you buy some tracker device, you put it on your wrist, and you want to track how often you go running. Do you expect that data to be around in 20 years? You know, what have you actually signed up for? Most of these things are free. For me, if you're not paying for it, then you get what you get.
Well, free. Yeah, I mean, there's sunken cost in the actual device itself when you purchase it, and I think that's what I read. Some people actually, so I read that there was class actions ready to go, basically, because people were saying,
yeah. But for me, I find that a bit silly, because if like you buy a normal watch, it doesn't track anything. So it's like, what are you actually expecting? And it's always a case of nobody ever reads the terms and conditions of what they sign up for.
Isn't that just the point, though? The point that I'm sort of getting at is that data is, no one thinks that data is critical until it's not there or not accessible. That's kind of what I'm trying to get at, right? And no one will look at the EULA or look at the thing they've signed in when they actually apply for the website or whatever it is. They just expect it to be there regardless. So yeah, it's an interesting one. I get what you're saying, but I think we've moved on so far.
You never buy a house without.
I guess David, it comes down to, so you both agree with each other when it comes to no one reads the T's and C's. But then if that data is so important to you, there's probably a way of extracting that data so that you can have a copy yourself. The responsibility.
Well, I worked out a way. Yeah, there is. Yeah, so there is a way.
DSV or something like that as a kind of a backup. But yeah, I don't know if that's easy. I've never done it because I don't expect to have
But what does it say about us as a society that this is what we're talking about? We're talking about, I need my data on my I can tell you right now, totally unrelated to this incident, I found myself wearing a smartwatch for like constantly, and I hit the point where I felt like I was oversaturated on alerts and notifications, whatever. I took it off. I'm done for a while. I'm just taking it off, taking a break. And I like tracking my my steps. Like, that's cool. I like the fitness data, but do I really need that? I don't think so. So yes, I have my Nokia someplace around here too.
Nokia. Well, I had this watch here. I mean, this is just a basic watch, right? And it's not a smart watch. It just tracks my steps and whatever else, right? Now, I was on a 107-day streak before they had those issues.
I
of
ruined my
10,000
streak
steps.
by doing
And I
this,
was
right?
like,
Like I
I
ruined
don't
all
wanna
my
break my
awards
streak.
and stuff, but hey,
Yeah.
whatever.
All I was worried was about my streak, because in my streak was making me feel good, like inside. I know it sounds a bit whatever, but I think that's where we're at as humans, that it does actually impact people. So the data is so critical because it is that important. I'm sticking to that a lot of people out there were like, where is it? I need it.
Yeah, but if you look at society in general, like Melissa was saying, you know, you put something on Instagram, you get excited when there's like 50 people like it. You're like, oh, I'm so popular. It's Instagram, you know. So the fact that you're actually enjoying doing your fitness and you're seeing these streaks and it's making you feel good about yourself doesn't actually shouldn't surprise anyone, I don't think, in today's society. It's all about just looking at things and the way that the devices and the technology now has been tailored to trigger something in your brain.
That's right. Therefore,
Addiction.
it's
addiction.
important.
It is an addiction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Therefore, it's important. Therefore, it needs to be backed up and protected. Therefore, ransomware attacks that target these companies are of critical nature, as was shown.
But
So I think in a roundabout way, we're all agreeing with the same thing.
Yeah, the way I look at it though is it's still your responsibility. But I don't expect Apple to back up my iPhone. You know, if I drop my iPhone in the lake like my wife did 3 weeks ago, which was really helpful, you know, mine's backed up.
Okay.
So
here we go. So just say you did back it up. Say you went backed up to iTunes, and then iTunes lost it, and that was it. Because that's kind of the analogy. That's kind of the same thing that what we're talking about here.
Back it up. Yeah, but I back it up to Dropbox, and then Dropbox.
You are very astute.
So he's following the proper backup rules for personal data. That is so important, right? Like he's following.
It's technology.
Where's your offsite?
You still need iTunes.
But this is, you don't get in a car and drive a car without knowing how it works. Well, how to drive. A lot of people drive cars not knowing how they work, and that's the same thing with technology, in my opinion. You need to understand what you're doing. And
let's try and quickly finish up with another bit of security. I think the Twitter hacks. I think Melissa wanted to talk about that.
Don't you mean a social media network?
Well, no, we can say Twitter. We're streaming on this platform right now, so it's all good.
Sorry, John.
But that was critically high profile. People's high profile accounts got hacked, basically as a way for
was it
people to try and get Bitcoin. Yeah,
was it hacked,
Bitcoin.
Though? Can you call it a hack?
Well, what do you think, Melissa?
Clearly,
it was internal. It was an internal threat. People had access to the admin panel and were able to do this kind of stuff. So
you're saying, was that proven that it was an internal malicious actor that basically did it? And
why don't you look it up on Twitter and see what people were saying about it, right? So the thing is, like, so the term hack, right? I don't know, like to hack, like literally means like to tinker. Like if I take apart a computer and put it back together, technically I'm hacking it, right? I'm tinkering and blah, blah, blah. That's where like the term originates from. So we blanketly use this term hack. And I feel like there's this thing in our brains that automatically we think some evil guy in a beanie and a sweatshirt and a hoodie in a basement someplace is at their keyboard and doing all this stuff. Where it could be anybody, right? It could be anyone, anywhere, anytime, internal, external, doing it.
Yeah. When I was at university doing my master's, I did an ethical hacking course, and I learned that there was two versions. There's a cracker and a hacker. So, but hacker is the one that we use all the time. I don't know if you know that. You probably know that, right, Melissa? The cracker.
Well, but again, when you hear the term hacker, like your brain automatically goes to the guy in the hoodie in the basement with the sunglasses, right? Like that's what you think of. But it's really, you know,
beanie.
The beanie.
War games. Yeah. That's all I'm going to say. We've been all dreaming of being hackers since we were all kids.
Oh, we love it. It's so much more than that. It just goes back to prove, and especially we talked about the rise of the CISO, right? Security is this huge multifaceted thing. It's not just protecting against the hackers, because the hackers can be anywhere, anytime. They can be internal, they can be external, they could be friendly. They could just be like, hey, Twitter, just so you know, I found a bug on your website when I was messing around. You might want to fix it, right? They can be ethical and responsible.
Yes, they are. Yeah, that's correct.
Or they could just be bad actors who just want to break stuff, right? So
and drive Lamborghinis.
It just want and drive Lamborghinis. Who doesn't want to drive Lamborghini? I prefer Ferraris actually, the Lamborghinis, but
Maserati. Yeah, I'm a Maserati.
Maseratis aren't bad either. But security is this multifaceted thing, and our gut reaction is to think of the guy in the basement with the beanie. But it's so much more. And as any organization, and even as a person, right, you need to be protecting yourself and your organization, your data and your assets against the whole array of threats. Just running antivirus isn't going to do it anymore.
So on that, so let's finish up by just doing a little bit of a Veeamy sort of, conversation about, how do we think companies should approach the strategy to protect themselves from that? I mean, as we've talked about, it's more of the reactive, what happens next, rather than the proactive, it's going to happen. So what's the best advice that we can give right now for companies to put themselves in a position to not be taken out because of a attack?
I feel like everybody needs to have a ransomware remediation plan in place. Like, what happens if we're ransomware today? Can people answer that question? Can people, almost like doing a DR test, right? Like, you have your DR plan. Here's how you recover. Here's how you test it.
That's interesting.
Ransomware plan might be kind of different, right? But the same tenets. You need that plan, right? It's not if you get ransomware, it's when. And the only way that you can beat it is to be ready when it happens. Are there tools out there that can help you detect it before it kind of pops? Yes, but you kind of have to go in thinking, what if it's too late when we find out? What if it's already active? What if it's already propagating? How do we reduce the collateral damage, right? How do we make it as least impactful as possible if we don't get it before it starts? Everybody's got to have this plan in place, everybody. That's the only way.
What about you?
You
Michael?
You need to test it. You need to do drills. You need to actually have a mock ransomware happen and see if you can actually recover.
Yeah,
what do you reckon, Michael?
Melissa, in that testing, that understanding and walking through that and get that into your muscle memory, because it's not a matter of if, it's when. So understanding how you get out of that issue is very important. I'll stick to the education piece as well.
Education, yeah.
Obviously, having the backup, and I'll give it the whole Veeam methodology, 3, 2, 1, and all of that, and making sure that you've got a copy of your data offsite, away from it. But that's your insurance policy, right? It's like you have to have that for you driving your car. You have to have that when you're driving along, and hopefully no one ever has to use that insurance policy because you've smashed your car up. But it's there if you need it, and you can then always leverage that if and when that happens. But it really comes down to the IT teams will know exactly what ransomware is and how to deal with that, or they should do. But then it's also about I'm going to use Sally again in finance. What does she need to do?
Poor Sally. What did Sally do to you?
Sally already knows. She understands it. If she gets that email that looks suspicious, she doesn't open it. Right? Don't just delete it. And it's been undetected by any antivirus software. Send it to your support desk and say, I think this looks a little bit suspicious, because they can add that to additional definitions and be able to enable and educate the rest of the workforce.
Mm-hmm. And it ties back to business continuity. Okay, ransomware's happening. How do we get Sally back online as quickly as possible so she can do her job? Especially if these systems are critical to business operations, right? So it ties directly back to your business continuity. Now, do you declare a DR in the event of ransomware? Maybe some people do. Maybe somebody just shuts down the whole site and starts up the second site. But then you get into, okay, if it's replication, it's backups, whatever, am I restoring good data? And is there a way to know that you're restoring good data, Michael?
You just plug Secure Restore and Data Labs in one. How you can ensure
that's why we've got her on. That's why we've got her on.
Yeah. So restore, when you restore, whether you're restoring anywhere, it gives you the ability to run a scan with any antivirus software.
Yeah. All right, guys. Well, I think at the end of the day, I think we agree ransomware bad. I think that's pretty much
Very
the way
bad.
it is, and very, very bad. And it's obviously becoming a lot more sophisticated, and especially I've got a feeling as well, given that we're going to be at home for a little bit more time.
People are going to get
bored because it's like teenagers, right? And typically the majority of them could be really smart little script kiddie kind of teenagers that love driving Lamborghinis again. Man, it's hot in this thing. Oof. Don't know how these hackers do it. Take it off. I couldn't be a hacker. But yeah, look, I just think people are going to be aware of it more and more and more. It's going to get more sophisticated, and we're going to see some more high-profile attacks, unfortunately, and it's just the way it is. But you've got to be ready. That's the key. And just be ready, like Melissa and Michael have said. And like David said, too bad if you lose your fitness data. It is what it is. All right. With that, we're going to end episode 7. And thanks for joining us. And we will see you again next time. Thanks, guys. It's been fun.